The document was 14 pages long. It took the President of the United States less than 4 minutes to read it, or rather, less than 4 minutes to stop reading it. He called it verbatim a piece of garbage. He told reporters he didn't even finish it. And with those 11 words spoken in a White House corridor on the afternoon of May 12, 2026, the last functioning diplomatic off-ramp between the United States and Iran collapsed into the floor. What you are watching right now is not a negotiation failing. Negotiations fail when two parties cannot agree on terms. What is happening in the Persian Gulf at this hour is something categorically different. It is the mathematical endpoint of a war that has consumed $29 billion in 73 days, a figure the Pentagon confirmed to Congress this afternoon, upwardly revised from $25 billion just 2 weeks ago. And it is a war that has now eaten through more than 50% of America's Tomahawk cruise missile inventory and a comparable share of its JASSM precision-guided munitions. That is not a negotiation failing. That is a supply chain running toward a wall. And the question that no senior official in Washington is willing to answer on the record, but that every serious military planner is asking in the rooms you are not allowed inside, is a very simple one. What happens when the wall arrives? Let me give you the operational picture as it stands at this hour. Not the diplomatic language, not the press release, the data. On the morning of May 12, 2026, Brent crude oil hit $107.55 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate crossed $101.25. The Trump administration responded by authorizing the release of 53.3 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a move that temporarily softened futures markets, but did nothing to address the structural reality underneath those numbers. The Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed to commercial traffic. The U.S. Navy's Project Freedom, its escorted convoy initiative designed to force the strait open, has been placed in indefinite suspension after Iranian anti-ship missile batteries and unmanned surface vessels made the risk-to-reward calculation untenable for commercial insurers. 65 commercial vessels have been turned back. 4 ships that attempted to breach the blockade have been, in CENTCOM's clinical terminology, neutralized. Saudi Aramco's CEO stated this week that the disruption is costing global markets 100 million barrels per week. That number is not a projection. It is a current operating reality. And the war that produced this reality has now cost the United States government, by the Pentagon's own conservative public accounting, $29 billion, with internal assessments suggesting the true figure has already cleared $50 billion. $24 billion of those $29 billion went to a single line item, replacing what was used. Not rebuilding, not expanding, simply replacing the munitions consumed in 73 days of sustained operations. I want you to hold that number for a moment before we go further, because the decision the Oval Office made this afternoon, the decision to call Iran's 14-point ceasefire proposal garbage and walk away, cannot be understood without first understanding what that $24 billion replacement figure actually represents. The Tomahawk cruise missile is manufactured by Raytheon Technologies at a facility in Tucson, Arizona. The production rate, optimized for peacetime resupply and modest surge capacity, runs at approximately 260 missiles per year in standard configuration. The United States has consumed more than 50% of its operational Tomahawk inventory since February 28th. You do not need a classified briefing to understand what that means. You need arithmetic. At 260 units per year, the maximum the current industrial base can sustain without a multi-year capital investment cycle, replenishing a 50% inventory shortfall takes approximately 2 years. And that assumes the production line is dedicated entirely to restocking, which it cannot be, because new orders from program requirements and allied sales also compete for that capacity. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of Indo-Pacific Forces, told Congress this plainly. Stocking back to pre-war levels will require 4 years. 4 years. The AGM-158 JASSM, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, the weapon the Air Force uses when it needs to strike a hardened target from outside the enemy's defensive envelope, faces the same constraint. Lockheed Martin's production line runs at a rate that cannot be surged quickly. The component supply chains are measured in months, not weeks. Now hold those production timelines against the geopolitical calendar. The 60-day clock under the 1973 War Powers Resolution is approaching its constitutional limit. Without congressional authorization, the President's authority to maintain U.S. forces in combat operations abroad reaches its legal boundary. Senators Tim Kaine and Chris Coons have already introduced resolution language designed to force a vote. The White House has responded by arguing, with genuine legal creativity, that the ceasefire period paused the clock. That argument will not survive a determined congressional challenge, which means the White House today faced a specific convergence of pressures: declining munitions stocks, a congressional clock, a global oil price that is feeding directly into U.S. consumer inflation. The latest CPI reading came in at 3.8%, with gasoline alone up 5.4% year over year. And a domestic population that is paying 50% more at the pump than it was on February 27th. And into that convergence, Iran handed Washington a 14-page document. The content of Iran's 14-point proposal is more important than the president's reaction to it. Not because the proposal was reasonable by Washington's standards, it was not, but because understanding what Iran asked for is the only way to understand why the gap is not closable by any currently available diplomatic mechanism. Iran did not submit a list of negotiating positions. It submitted a list of structural outcomes. The permanent cessation of all hostilities across every front where Iran's aligned forces are engaged: Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, not as a negotiated drawdown, but as an irreversible settlement condition. The immediate lifting of the U.S. naval blockade on Iranian ports and the formal recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. War reparations from the United States government. The release of all frozen Iranian assets. The removal of all sanctions on Iranian oil exports within 30 days. Not in 6 months. Not contingent on IAEA verification. Within 30 days. The core issue, the one the White House identified as the non-negotiable breaking point, was uranium. Iran had previously indicated through Pakistani intermediaries that it would allow the transfer of highly enriched uranium out of the country under a verified arrangement. That language disappeared from the written document. The gap between what Iran put on paper and what Washington's minimum requirements are is not a negotiating gap. It is not a gap you bridge with creative diplomatic language or back-channel compromise. It is a gap measured in two fundamentally incompatible definitions of what the outcome of this war means. For Washington, the minimum acceptable outcome is verifiable Iranian nuclear disarmament and regime behavior change. For Tehran, the minimum acceptable outcome is international recognition of the existing Iranian state, including its nuclear enrichment infrastructure, with material compensation for the damage inflicted since February 28th. Those two positions do not overlap, and both sides understand that. What makes the diplomatic collapse of May 12th qualitatively different from every previous breakdown in U.S.-Iran relations is the nuclear arithmetic operating underneath the surface negotiations. I want to be precise about this because the public language around Iran's nuclear program has been so systematically imprecise for so long that the actual operational reality has become obscured behind political rhetoric. Here is the operational reality as of this date. Iran's Fordow enrichment facility, the underground installation built into a mountain approximately 30 kilometers from Qom, designed specifically to survive the kind of airstrikes that Operation Epic Fury delivered in February, is running. The facility was not destroyed. It was not significantly degraded. It continues to operate. Before the war, Fordow was producing uranium enriched to 60% purity at a rate of approximately 4.7 kilograms per month. As of the most recent IAEA assessment, before inspectors were expelled following the outbreak of hostilities, that rate had increased to 37 kilograms per month. 37 kilograms per month at 60% enrichment in a facility that American and Israeli aircraft cannot reach with conventional weapons, operated by technicians whose access cannot be monitored because the surveillance cameras have been removed. The weapons grade threshold is 90%. Iranian parliamentarians have now publicly stated that if U.S. or Israeli military operations resume, Iran will enrich to 90% purity. That is not a threat framed as a negotiating position. It is a statement of operational capability being held in reserve as a deterrent. The breakout time, the interval between a political decision and sufficient weapons-grade material for one nuclear device, has been assessed by arms control specialists at 1 to 2 weeks. 1 to 2 weeks. That timeline was not achievable 18 months ago. It is achievable now. And the diplomatic process that might have provided some constraint on it has, as of this afternoon, been formally rejected. The White House called the proposal garbage. Iran's parliament speaker called America's strategy erroneous decisions leading to erroneous outcomes. His words were followed by a statement that Iranian armed forces are ready to respond and to teach lessons to any aggressor. That sequence, proposal, rejection, military threat, completed itself in under 6 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. I have spent considerable time in my career studying how institutions behave when they are caught between an impossible set of options. What I observed from Washington today was not a government choosing the aggressive path over the diplomatic one. It was a government that concluded, correctly by its own internal logic, that neither path leads to an acceptable destination. This is the paradox the United States entered on February 28th, when the first B-2 dropped the first ordnance on Iranian soil. The military operation was designed to achieve two things simultaneously: destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure and produce a regime change dynamic that would bring a more compliant government to power in Tehran. The first objective was partially achieved. Fordow was not destroyed. Natanz sustained significant damage, but remains operational. The centrifuge cascades continue to spin. The second objective failed entirely. The killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury, a decapitation strike that represented the most aggressive opening move in American military history since 1945, did not produce the regime collapse Washington anticipated. It produced consolidation. It produced a government in Tehran that is now operating under an existential imperative that makes compromise on core security questions politically impossible. There is a term in military planning for the moment when a strategy's foundational assumption is invalidated by operational reality. The term is culmination point. The decision to call Iran's 14-point proposal garbage and walk away from Pakistani-mediated talks may, in retrospect, be the moment historians identify as the political culmination point of Operation Epic Fury, the moment when the gap between what the operation was designed to achieve and what it is capable of achieving became visible to the people who authorized it. The $29 billion figure tells part of that story. The munitions inventory depletion tells another part. The oil price tells a third. But the most consequential element of today's events is the one that will not show up in any budget document or defense appropriations request. Congress was told this afternoon in closed session, followed by selective briefing, that U.S. military commanders have been pulling assets from other theaters to sustain operations in the Persian Gulf. Specifically, THAAD interceptor batteries and ANTPY-2 radar systems that were positioned in the Korean Peninsula have been moved, under emergency classification codes, to the Central Command Area of Operations. The THAAD system is the United States' primary terminal defense against ballistic missiles. There is one theater in the world where the calculus of ballistic missile threat is more acute than the Persian Gulf. That theater is the Korean Peninsula, where a nuclear-armed North Korea maintains an inventory of road-mobile ballistic missiles capable of striking Seoul, Tokyo, and U.S. bases in Guam. The THAAD batteries that were defending against that threat are now in the Middle East. Admiral Paparo has stated publicly that the redeployment has created a gap. He did not specify the nature of that gap in open session. He did not need to. Every military planner in Seoul, Tokyo, and Pyongyang understands the nature of that gap precisely. China understands it too. The Trump-Xi Jinping summit scheduled for the coming days in Beijing was supposed to be about trade and technology. It is now, regardless of the official agenda, about something more fundamental. The question of whether China will use its leverage over Iran to pull Tehran toward a negotiated settlement, and what it expects in return for doing so. What China expects in return is the question that has no clean answer in Washington. Xi Jinping arrives at the summit table with a position of extraordinary structural advantage. China is Iran's largest oil customer. The Qingdao Haihe oil terminal, one of the entities sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department this morning in the latest economic fury enforcement action, has been processing tens of millions of barrels of sanctioned Iranian crude. The timing of that sanction announcement on the eve of the summit is not coincidental. It is a message. It is Washington telling Beijing, we see what you are doing, and we are prepared to make it costly. Whether that message lands as a deterrent or as a provocation is a question that will be answered in the next 72 hours. The broader picture is this. The United States has spent $29 billion, conservatively, fighting a war that has not achieved its stated objectives, has depleted strategic weapons inventories that will take 4 years to restore, has pulled missile defense assets away from the Pacific theater at a moment of elevated tension, and has produced a diplomatic outcome today that brings the Middle East no closer to resolution. While Washington's attention was concentrated on the diplomatic collapse, something else was happening at the edges of the operational picture that deserves careful analysis. On May 1st, 11 days before today's events, Kuwaiti armed forces engaged a group of armed infiltrators attempting to land on Bubiyan Island via a rented fishing vessel. One Kuwaiti soldier was wounded. 4 Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel were captured. 2 escaped. Kuwait's deputy foreign minister summoned the Iranian ambassador and delivered a formal protest note. Kuwait stated it reserves the right to invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter, the self-defense provision, in connection with the incident. Bubiyan Island is not a random piece of geography. It is the site of the Mubarak al-Kabir port, a massive infrastructure project built with Chinese capital under the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran just sent a commando team to a location hosting Chinese economic infrastructure. That action communicates simultaneously to multiple audiences. To Kuwait, your neutrality offers no protection. To the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the conflict has no perimeter. To China, Your investments in this region are not insulated from the consequences of your decisions about Iranian oil. To Washington, Iran's operational reach extends in directions your planning did not fully account for. Israel read the same landscape differently. On May 12th, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee confirmed what intelligence analysts had been assessing for weeks. Israel has physically deployed Iron Dome batteries and military personnel to the United Arab Emirates. The announcement was direct, it was unambiguous, and it represents something that has no precedent in the history of either country or the region. An Israeli military force is now based permanently and officially on Arab soil, not in a liaison capacity, not as technical advisors, but as an operational air defense unit responsible for intercepting Iranian missiles aimed at Emirati territory. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, were described as a diplomatic normalization. What we are watching in May 2026 is something categorically different. It is a mutual defense architecture, now physically instantiated in steel and radar and military personnel. Every Iranian military planner reading that confirmation is running the same calculation. The perimeter of what must be defended against and what must be deterred has expanded geometrically. The domestic American dimension of what happened today is not separable from the strategic one. The U.S. Consumer Price Index, as of the most recent Labor Department release, is running at 3.8% annually. Gasoline prices, year over year, are up 5.4%. At the pump, Americans are paying 50% more than they were on February 27th, the day before Operation Epic Fury began. The Trump administration's response has been to draw down strategic reserves and request that Congress authorize a suspension of the federal gasoline tax. Neither of those measures addresses the structural supply problem. The Hormuz Strait is closed. It will remain closed as long as the conflict continues. Every barrel of oil that does not transit that strait carries a risk premium that flows directly into the price of every product manufactured or transported anywhere in the world. European grocery prices, Asian manufacturing costs, shipping container rates on the Pacific, all of it has been repriced upward by the events of the past 73 days, and none of it unwinds until the strait reopens. The political arithmetic for the White House is not complicated, but it has no easy solution. Accept Iran's terms, the terms today described as garbage, and the administration absorbs a narrative of capitulation that may be politically unsurvivable. Resume full-scale military operations and risk a further escalation of oil prices, additional munitions depletion, and the activation of Iranian escalatory options that include the nuclear threshold warning issued this week by Tehran's parliamentary leadership. There is no third option currently on the table. Canada, America's closest ally and northern neighbor, made its position explicit weeks ago. Ottawa will not participate in offensive military operations, and Canadians oppose them by a margin of 70% in polling. The European allies are watching their Ukraine ammunition pipelines compress as American munitions production redirects toward Gulf requirements. The NATO resupply architecture that was supporting Ukrainian forces against Russian pressure is fraying at the edges because the industrial base cannot simultaneously sustain two major combat theaters. This is not speculation. This is the explicit concern of European and Canadian defense ministries, stated in diplomatic communications that have been partially surfaced in congressional testimony. Russia is observing all of it with the unhurried attention of a government that is benefiting from every day the United States remains absorbed in the Persian Gulf. I want to be precise about what today's events actually represent, stripped of diplomatic language and domestic political framing. The Pentagon told Congress this afternoon that the war has cost $29 billion in 73 days. Of that, $24 billion was spent not on any strategic gain, but on replacing what was consumed. The war has metabolized more than half of America's most critical precision strike munitions inventory. It has pulled missile defense assets from the one theater where their absence creates the most dangerous potential secondary crisis. It has contributed to an inflation dynamic that is directly eroding the standard of living of American consumers. And it has failed, by the Pentagon's own metrics, to achieve either of its primary strategic objectives: verifiable nuclear disarmament and regime change in Tehran. Iran, meanwhile, submitted a 14-point proposal today that the president rejected in under 4 minutes. I am not suggesting Iran's proposal was reasonable by any standard framework of international negotiation. It was not. The demands: war reparations, full sanction relief in 30 days, formal recognition of Hormuz sovereignty, reflect a maximalist opening position, not a genuine compromise offer. But the substance of the proposal matters less than the structure of what its rejection reveals. When a government has spent $29 billion, depleted its most critical weapons inventories, endured 15 soldiers killed and 538 wounded, pulled missile defense from the Korean Peninsula, driven oil to $107 a barrel, inflated its domestic consumer price index to 3.8%, fractured its relationship with its most important NATO partners, and approached the constitutional limit of its war-making authority under the 1973 War Powers Resolution, and then rejects in under 4 minutes the only document on the table that could stop all of it from continuing. That rejection is not a negotiating posture. It is a signal. It is a government that has concluded that the domestic political cost of accepting any available terms exceeds the operational cost of continuing a war it is not winning. That is not a strategic position. It is a trap. The question I want to leave you with is not rhetorical. At $29 billion in 73 days, a rate of approximately $397 million per day, the operational arithmetic of this conflict points toward a specific horizon. Munitions that take 4 years to replace are being consumed at rates that the domestic defense industrial base cannot match. THAAD systems that protect treaty allies in the Pacific are repositioned in the Gulf. The 60-day war powers clock is expiring. The diplomatic process that might have provided an exit is, as of this afternoon, formally suspended. Iran's parliament speaker said today that his forces are ready to respond and teach lessons to any aggressor. Iran's nuclear specialists have the ability to enrich to weapons grade within a 2-week breakout window, in a facility that cannot be reached by conventional air power. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Oil is at $107. And the President of the United States called the only document on the table a piece of garbage without finishing it. In 30 years of studying how the decisions that reshape the global order are actually made, not in the history books, but in the rooms where the options run out one by one, I have learned that the most consequential moments are almost never the ones that announce themselves as historic. They are the ones that look, in real time, like just another bad afternoon. May 12th, 2026 was a very bad afternoon. Whether it was just a bad afternoon is the question that the next 72 hours will begin to answer.